Hey guys, tonight we dive into the frozen hellscape of medieval Scandinavia, where Vikings didn't just survive winter, they turned it into a masterclass in not dying horribly. The same people who gave us longships, blood eagles, and the revolutionary concept of wearing fur instead of freezing to death like civilized people. So before we get cozy, hit that like button if you enjoy having all your fingers and toes, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you're currently experiencing hypothermia. Now grab something warm, maybe light a fire that won't burn your house down, and let's settle in for tonight's tale of survival. So, you think you could handle a Viking winter? Sweet summer child, that's like a goldfish thinking it could survive in the Arctic Ocean. Picture this, it's the dead of winter in 9th century Scandinavia, and the sun hasn't bothered to show up for work in 3 months. Not fashionably late, completely absent. The kind of darkness that makes you question whether the gods have simply given up on the whole light situation entirely. Outside your longhouse, the wind isn't just howling, it's conducting a full orchestra of misery, complete with percussion provided by ice chunks the size of warrior helmets smashing against your walls. This wasn't just cold. This was the kind of cold that made your breath freeze mid, exhale and fall to the ground with a tiny crystalline tinkle, like nature's own wind chimes of despair. The kind of cold that turned your morning urine into an ice sculpture before it hit the snow. The kind of cold that made you understand why your ancestors invented concepts like Ragnarok. Because surely the world ending in fire and ice wasn't metaphor. It was a weather forecast. But here's the thing about Vikings, they didn't just survive this frozen hellscape. They thrived in it. They built empires in it. They raised families, told stories, got drunk, started fights, and planned their next raids while the rest of Europe was huddled around pathetic little fires, praying for spring like it was the second coming of Christ. Which, coincidentally, many of them hadn't heard of yet, being busy worshipping Thor, who at least had the decency to carry a hammer instead of turning the other cheek. So how did they do it? How did these fur-wrapped, mead, drinking, axe-wielding specimens of northern stubbornness not only survive, but actually look forward to winter nights? Grab a horn of something strong. Settle in by whatever heat source you've got, and let me tell you exactly how the Vikings turned the coldest nights of the year from a death sentence into just another Tuesday. First, let's talk about the longhouse, because calling it a house is like calling a dragon a large lizard. Technically accurate but missing the point entirely. These weren't houses. They were survival fortresses disguised as communal living spaces. Imagine a building designed by someone who understood that winter wasn't just a season. It was a 5-month-long siege by the forces of hypothermia, starvation, and cabin fever. The average Viking longhouse stretched anywhere from 60 to 200 feet long, longer than some modern apartment buildings are tall. Why so big? Because when the temperature outside could freeze your spit before it left your mouth, you needed room for everyone and everything that was going to keep you alive until the sun remembered how to do its job. The walls weren't just walls. They were multi-layered defensive systems against the cold. Start with a frame of oak or pine, wood that had been selected not for its beauty, but for its stubbornness, its refusal to bow to wind or weather. Over this frame went layers of turf, sod, and stone, creating walls that were sometimes 3 feet thick. 3 feet of earth and stone between you and the kind of cold that could kill a grown man in minutes. But here's where it gets clever. These walls weren't just thick, they were alive. The sod and turf continued growing, creating a living, breathing barrier that actually got better at insulation as time passed. The grass roots formed an intricate network that trapped air, nature's own insulation system. In summer, these walls were gardens. In winter, they were the difference between life and death. The roof was another marvel of practical engineering. Layers of birch bark, then turf, then more sod, all supported by massive wooden beams that could hold the weight of several feet of snow without groaning. Snow, as any Viking worth his salt knew, wasn't just something to shovel. It was additional insulation. The more snow that piled up on your roof, the warmer your house became. It was like nature was tucking you in with a blanket made of frozen water. Inside, the longhouse was divided into sections, each with its own purpose in the grand strategy of not freezing to death. The center was dominated by the fire pit, Not a fireplace, mind you, but a long, rectangular pit that ran down the middle of the hall like a river of warmth and light. This wasn't just for heat, it was the heart of Viking civilization. Around this fire, entire communities would gather to eat, drink, tell stories, settle disputes, plan raids, and engage in the ancient art of surviving winter by pretending it wasn't happening. The fire pit was kept burning constantly from the first freeze until the last thaw, constantly. As in, someone was always responsible for making sure those flames never died, because if they did, everyone else might follow suit. This wasn't a job for the lazy or absent-minded. This was a sacred duty, passed from person to person in shifts that lasted through the night. The fire keeper wasn't just maintaining a flame, they were maintaining life itself. But fire needs fuel, and fuel was a precious commodity when everything outside was either frozen solid or buried under snow. This is where Viking ingenuity really shone. They didn't just collect firewood, they planned their entire year around having enough fuel to survive the winter. Spring and summer weren't just for raiding and farming. They were for collecting, cutting, and storing every piece of combustible material they could find. Wood, obviously, but not just any wood. Different woods burned differently, and Vikings knew their timber like modern people know their coffee orders. Oak burned hot and long, perfect for banking coals that would smoulder through the night. Pine burned fast and bright, ideal for quickly heating a space or cooking food. Birch bark was like nature's kindling, catching fire easily and burning hot enough to ignite damp wood. Juniper burned clean and gave off a pleasant smell that helped mask the less pleasant aromas of 20 people living in close quarters for months. But wood wasn't the only fuel. Vikings burned anything that would catch fire and produce heat, dried animal dung, which burned longer and hotter than you might expect. Bones, which gave off intense heat and were readily available after meals. Dried peat, cut from bogs in summer and stored like brown gold. Even oil from fish and seals, which burned with a smoky flame that provided both heat and light. They became connoisseurs of combustion, experts in the art of turning anything organic into heat energy. A good Viking could look at a piece of driftwood and tell you not just what kind of tree it came from, but how long it would burn and what temperature it would reach. This wasn't academic knowledge. This was survival expertise passed down through generations of people who understood that the difference between a good fire and a bad fire was often the difference between seeing spring and becoming a frozen corpse. The smoke from these fires was directed out through a hole in the roof, but even this was calculated. The hole was positioned and sized to create the perfect balance. Large enough to let out smoke and prevent everyone from suffocating, small enough to retain heat and prevent snow from falling directly into the fire. Some longhouses had adjustable roof openings, with sliding panels that could be opened or closed depending on wind direction and weather intensity. Around the fire pit, the longhouse was arranged with military precision. Sleeping areas were positioned to maximize heat retention while maintaining privacy and hierarchy. The most important people, the Jarl, his family, honored warriors, slept closest to the fire. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival strategy. The most valuable members of the community needed to stay the warmest because they were the most critical for everyone's survival. But don't think the common folk were left to freeze. Viking society might have had hierarchies, but it also understood that everyone had to survive for anyone to survive. The sleeping areas farther from the fire were compensated with additional furs, shared body heat, and clever positioning near walls that had absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Speaking of sleeping arrangements, forget everything you think you know about privacy and personal space. In winter, the longhouse became a human hibernation den where individual sleeping quarters were a luxury nobody could afford. Families slept together, not just parents and children, but extended families, retainers, servants, and anyone else who happened to be part of the household. Sleeping alone was essentially a death sentence. When the temperature dropped low enough, the beds themselves were marvels of medieval engineering designed for maximum heat retention. Start with a wooden platform, not for comfort, but to keep bodies off the frozen ground, which would suck heat from your body faster than a greedy tax collector. On top of this platform went layers upon layers of furs, hides and woven materials. Bear fur for the base layer, thick, warm and durable. Wolf pelts for the middle layers, providing insulation while still allowing some airflow. Sheep wool and rabbit fur for the top layers, soft against the skin, but dense enough to trap body heat. These weren't just random animal skins thrown together. Vikings had specific knowledge about which furs provided the best insulation, which ones breathed well enough to prevent overheating and sweating, and which ones could be layered for maximum efficiency. A well-made Viking bed was like a medieval sleeping system, with different components serving different purposes in the grand strategy of staying warm through the night. And then there were the sleeping furs themselves, the blankets and coverings that turned a pile of animal skins into a warm, comfortable sleeping space. The outer layer was usually seal skin or walrus hide, materials that were not only warm but also windproof and water resistant. Underneath went layers of wolf, bear, fox, and rabbit fur, each chosen for specific properties. The arrangement wasn't random, it was based on centuries of trial and error, with knowledge passed down from parents to children like family recipes. But staying warm wasn't just about passive insulation. Vikings were active in their approach to heat generation. Before climbing into bed, they would heat stones by the fire and wrap them in cloth or leather, creating primitive hot water bottles that would keep their feet warm through the night. Some families had special heating stones that were kept by the fire all day, then rotated into beds each evening, providing hours of radiant warmth. They also understood the power of shared body heat. Sleeping arrangements weren't just about family units, they were about thermal efficiency. Children slept between adults, taking advantage of heat generated by larger bodies. Elderly people, who had more trouble generating their own heat, were positioned next to the warmest sleepers. Even the family dogs weren't just pets. They were furry heat sources that were welcomed into sleeping areas, providing additional warmth while also serving as early warning systems for any disturbances outside. The clothing Vikings wore to bed was another layer of their survival strategy. This wasn't pajamas as we know them. These were specialized sleeping garments designed for maximum heat retention. Wool undergarments that wicked moisture away from the skin while providing insulation. Fur-lined caps that prevented heat loss through the head. Thick woolen socks that could be layered with fur-lined slippers. Even special sleeping mittens that kept hands warm while allowing enough dexterity to adjust blankets or tend to children. But let's talk about what they ate during these frozen months. Because food wasn't just fuel for the body. It was fuel for the internal furnace that kept them alive. Viking winter cuisine was all about calories, fat, and foods that would generate internal heat while providing the energy needed to survive months of cold weather. The cornerstone of winter eating was preserved meat, and Vikings had turned food preservation into an art form that would make modern survival experts weep with envy. Starting in late summer and early fall, Viking households began the great preparation for winter, converting every available animal protein into forms that would last through the frozen months. Smoking was the most common preservation method, but not the gentle smoking you might imagine. This was industrial, level meat processing, with entire buildings dedicated to the art of turning fresh meat into preserved protein. The smokehouses were carefully constructed to maintain the perfect balance of heat, smoke, and airflow. Too much heat, and the meat would cook instead of preserve. Too little, and it would rot. Too much moisture, and it would spoil. Too little, and it would become inedible leather. The smoking process took weeks, with different meats requiring different treatments. Fish were hung on wooden racks and slowly smoked over fires of specific wood types. Birch for salmon, juniper for trout, oak for larger fish. The smoke didn't just preserve the meat, it added flavor and additional calories in the form of absorbed fats and oils. Meat was cut into strips and smoked until it became what we might recognize as jerky. But this was jerky with a purpose beyond snacking. This preserved meat was dense with protein and fat, designed to provide maximum nutrition in minimum space. A small portion could provide the calories needed to maintain body heat and energy levels through a long, cold day. But smoking wasn't the only preservation method. Vikings also perfected the art of salting, pickling, and fermentation. Entire barrels of meat were preserved in salt, creating stores of protein that would remain edible for months. Fish were packed in salt until they became hard as wood, then stored in cool, dry places where they would remain good until needed. Fermentation was used not just for alcoholic beverages, but for food preservation. Fish and meat were allowed to ferment in controlled conditions, creating foods that were not only preserved, but actually more nutritious than their fresh counterparts. The fermentation process broke down proteins and made nutrients more available to the body, crucial when every calorie counted towards survival. During winter meals, these preserved meats were combined with other stored foods to create meals that were both sustaining and warming. Stews were the most common winter dish, not just because they were easy to prepare, but because they could be kept warm over the fire for hours, providing continuous access to hot food. These stews combined preserved meat with stored vegetables, grains, and fats, creating meals that were liquid heat in a bowl. The vegetables in these stews weren't the fresh produce we might expect. Vikings had developed sophisticated methods for preserving vegetables through the winter months. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were stored in underground pits lined with stones and covered with earth, creating natural refrigeration systems that kept vegetables fresh but not frozen. Cabbage was fermented into something resembling sauerkraut, providing not only preserved vegetables, but also vital vitamins that prevented scurvy during the long months without fresh food. Grains were another crucial component of winter survival. Barley, oats, and rye were harvested in fall and stored in specially constructed granaries that kept them dry and protected from vermin. These grains were ground into flour and used to make thick porridge, hearty bread, and the base for alcoholic beverages that provided both calories and a psychological boost during the darkest months. But the most important component of Viking winter diet was fat. Not just any fat, but carefully selected and preserved fats that provided the highest caloric density and the most efficient fuel for the body's heating system. Seal fat, whale blubber, bear fat, and pork lard were all prized for their ability to provide sustained energy and help the body maintain temperature in extreme cold. These fats weren't just eaten plain, though they sometimes were when survival demanded it. They were incorporated into every meal, used for cooking, mixed into porridge, and even eaten by the spoonful when additional calories were needed. A Viking winter diet might consist of 40–50% fat by calories, providing the energy needed to maintain body heat and sustain physical activity in harsh conditions. The preparation of winter meals was a community effort that started long before the first snowfall. Entire households would work together to preserve meat, store vegetables, and prepare the supplies that would sustain them through the frozen months. Women typically managed food preservation, but everyone participated in the work of survival. Cooking during winter was done primarily in large iron cauldrons suspended over the central fire. These cauldrons could hold enough stew to feed an entire household, and they were kept simmering constantly, allowing people to eat warm food throughout the day. The cauldrons were also efficient heat sources, radiating warmth into the longhouse while providing hot meals. The act of eating itself was part of the warmth generation strategy. Hot food raised body temperature, while the act of digestion created internal heat that helped maintain core temperature through the night. Meals were timed to provide maximum warming benefit. Large, hot meals in the evening before sleep, and smaller, high-energy meals throughout the day to maintain heat production. But Vikings didn't just eat to survive, they ate to thrive psychologically as well as physically. Winter meals were social events, opportunities for storytelling, planning, and maintaining the community bonds that were essential for survival. The evening meal around the central fire wasn't just about nutrition. It was about maintaining morale, sharing news, and reinforcing the social connections that made survival possible. Speaking of morale, let's talk about what Vikings drank during those long winter nights, because alcohol wasn't just a recreational beverage. It was a survival tool with multiple purposes. The most famous Viking drink was mead, but winter drinking was about much more than honey wine. Mead production began in summer and early fall, with careful attention to creating beverages that would not only last through winter, but actually improve with age. The fermentation process was controlled to produce different types of mead for different purposes. Strong mead provided quick warmth and high calories, Lighter meads could be consumed regularly without impairing judgment or physical ability. Spiced meads included herbs and roots that provided additional health benefits and helped combat winter illnesses. But mead wasn't the only alcoholic beverage in the Viking winter arsenal. They also produced ale from barley and other grains, creating beers that were lower in alcohol but higher in calories and nutrients. These ales were often the primary beverage during winter months, providing hydration, calories, and a psychological boost that helped combat the depression and anxiety that came with months of darkness and cold. Wine, when available through trade, was reserved for special occasions and important celebrations. But Vikings were resourceful brewers who could create alcoholic beverages from almost any organic material. They made wine from berries, fermented drinks from tree sap, and even alcoholic beverages from fermented milk. The alcohol itself served multiple survival functions. It provided quick calories and warmth, helping raise body temperature rapidly when needed. It served as a disinfectant for wounds and illnesses. It helped preserve foods and medicines. And perhaps most importantly, it provided psychological relief from the stress and depression of long winter months. Drinking during winter wasn't the wild, uncontrolled partying that popular culture might suggest. It was carefully managed consumption designed to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. Too much alcohol could impair judgment and physical ability, both potentially fatal in extreme cold. Too little meant missing out on the caloric and psychological benefits that helped people survive through the darkest months. Winter drinking was also a social activity that reinforced community bonds. Sharing drinks around the fire was a way of sharing resources, telling stories, making plans, and maintaining the relationships that made survival possible. The person who hoarded alcohol or refused to share was not just being antisocial. They were undermining the community cooperation that everyone depended on. The preparation of alcoholic beverages was another community effort that required planning, cooperation, and shared knowledge. Brewing and fermenting required specific skills and equipment, and the process had to be timed to ensure adequate supplies through the winter months. The knowledge of brewing was passed down through families and communities, with master brewers holding positions of respect and responsibility. But staying warm and fed was only part of the Viking winter survival strategy. They also had to maintain their physical and mental health through months of extreme conditions, and they developed sophisticated approaches to both medical care and psychological well-being. Viking medicine during winter focused heavily on prevention rather than cure, because getting sick when resources were limited and conditions were extreme could quickly become fatal. They understood the importance of maintaining physical fitness, even when outdoor activity was limited, so longhouses included spaces for indoor exercise and training. Warriors continued training throughout winter, not just to maintain their fighting skills, but to maintain the physical fitness that was essential for survival. Indoor training included wrestling, strength exercises using heavy objects, and combat practice with wooden weapons. This training served multiple purposes. It maintained physical condition, generated body heat through exercise, provided psychological benefits through physical activity, and reinforced social bonds through shared training. Women engaged in their own forms of winter exercise, often through the intensive physical labor required for winter survival tasks. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, preparing food, and maintaining the household required constant physical activity that helped maintain fitness and generate body heat. The work wasn't just about producing necessary items. It was about maintaining the physical condition needed to survive extreme conditions. Children had their own winter activities designed to maintain their health and fitness. Indoor games that required physical activity, junior versions of adult work tasks, and supervised play that kept them active and engaged. Children were particularly vulnerable to cold and illness, so maintaining their activity levels was crucial for their survival. Viking medicine also included sophisticated knowledge of herbs and natural remedies that could treat winter-related illnesses and conditions. They understood which plants could be preserved through winter and still maintain their medicinal properties. Dried herbs were stored carefully and used to treat everything from respiratory infections to digestive problems to injuries that might occur during winter activities. Some medicinal plants were actually more potent after preservation. Certain roots and bark were dried and stored, concentrating their active compounds and making them more effective as medicines. Vikings developed specific knowledge about which preservation methods worked best for different medicinal plants, and how to prepare and administer them for maximum effect. The treatment of injuries during winter required special consideration, because the cold made healing more difficult and infections more dangerous. Vikings developed techniques for treating wounds in cold conditions, using heated tools and warming treatments that helped promote healing while preventing infection. They understood that injuries that might be minor in warm weather could become life-threatening in winter conditions. Mental health was another crucial component of winter survival that Vikings understood long before modern psychology identified seasonal depression and cabin fever. They developed cultural practices and social structures specifically designed to maintain psychological well-being during the long, dark months. Storytelling was perhaps the most important psychological survival tool in the Viking arsenal. During the long winter nights, skilled storytellers would entertain entire households with epic tales, historical accounts, and mythological adventures. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were psychological medicine that helped people escape the confines of their physical situation and maintain hope for better times. The stories themselves were carefully chosen and crafted to provide maximum psychological benefit. Epic adventures reminded people of the world beyond their immediate circumstances. Historical tales reinforced cultural identity and community values. Mythological stories provided explanations for the harsh conditions they were experiencing and promised eventual relief and reward for endurance. Storytelling was also interactive, with audiences participating through responses, questions, and their own contributions to the narrative. This participation helped maintain social engagement and prevented the isolation and withdrawal that could be psychologically dangerous during long confinement. Music was another crucial component of psychological survival. Vikings had a rich tradition of winter music that included both instrumental and vocal performances. Songs served similar functions to stories, providing psychological escape and maintaining cultural connections. Singing together was also a physical activity that generated warmth and promoted group bonding. Instrumental music included drums, flutes, and stringed instruments that could be played indoors without disturbing the community. Musicians held positions of respect and responsibility, understanding that their skills weren't just artistic, but essential for community psychological health. Games and competitions provided mental stimulation and social interaction that helped prevent the psychological deterioration that could occur during long periods of confinement. Board games, dice games, riddle contests, and physical competitions all served to maintain mental acuity and social engagement. These games weren't just recreational, they often involved elements of strategy, memory, and skill that helped maintain cognitive function during periods when mental stimulation was limited. Some games were specifically designed to be played by firelight, using materials that were readily available and rules that could accommodate varying numbers of players. The creation of crafts and artwork during winter served both practical and psychological purposes. People worked on carving, metalwork, textile production, and other crafts that would be useful when warmer weather returned. But the creative work also provided mental stimulation, artistic expression, and a sense of accomplishment that helped maintain psychological well-being. Winter craft work was often highly social, with people working together on large projects or individual projects in communal spaces. The shared work provided opportunities for conversation, collaboration, and mutual support that helped maintain community bonds and individual morale. Religious and spiritual practices were also adapted for winter survival. While Vikings might not have been as formally religious as some other medieval peoples, they had spiritual traditions and practices that provided psychological support during difficult times. Winter solstice celebrations, ancestor reverence, and appeals to gods for protection and survival all served to maintain hope and cultural connections. These spiritual practices often included community rituals that brought people together for shared experiences that reinforced social bonds and provided psychological relief from the stress of survival. The rituals weren't just about religious belief, They were about maintaining the community unity that was essential for everyone's survival. But psychological survival wasn't just about community activities. It also required personal strategies for maintaining individual mental health. Vikings developed personal practices for dealing with the stress, boredom, and depression that could accompany long periods of harsh conditions. Personal meditation, reflection, and planning were all part of individual psychological maintenance. People would spend time thinking about future plans, remembering better times, and maintaining personal goals that would motivate them to continue surviving. This personal psychological work was just as important as community activities in maintaining overall mental health. The management of interpersonal conflicts was another crucial aspect of winter psychological survival. When people were confined together in small spaces for months, conflicts were inevitable. Vikings developed sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into community-threatening disputes. These conflict resolution methods included formal procedures for addressing grievances, community discussions of problems, and systems for compensating people who had been wronged. The goal wasn't just to resolve individual conflicts, but to maintain the community harmony that was essential for survival. Leaders played crucial roles in maintaining both individual and community psychological health. Jarls and other authority figures were responsible for maintaining morale, settling disputes, making decisions about resource allocation, and providing the leadership that helped communities survive extreme conditions. Good winter leaders understood that their role went far beyond simple authority. They were responsible for the psychological as well as physical survival of their people. This required skills in motivation, conflict resolution, resource management, and community building that were essential for successful winter leadership. The arrival of spring wasn't just a physical relief. It was a psychological triumph that validated all the effort and sacrifice that had gone into surviving another winter. The first signs of returning warmth and light were celebrated not just as weather changes, but as victories over the forces that had threatened their survival. These spring celebrations served multiple purposes. They marked the successful completion of another survival cycle. They provided opportunities to assess and repair any damage from winter. They allowed for the resumption of activities that had been suspended during the cold months, and they reinforced the community bonds that had made survival possible. But spring also brought new challenges and responsibilities. The stored foods that had sustained the community through winter needed to be replaced. Buildings and equipment that had been damaged by harsh weather needed repair. Plans for the coming year needed to be made and implemented, and the cycle of preparation for the next winter began almost immediately. The success of Viking winter survival wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, careful planning, community cooperation, and cultural practices specifically designed to help people not just survive but thrive in extreme conditions. Every aspect of their winter survival strategy was interconnected, with physical preparation supporting psychological well-being, community activities supporting individual survival, and individual efforts supporting community success. Their approach to winter survival was holistic, addressing not just the immediate needs of warmth and food, but the long-term requirements of physical health, mental well-being, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. They understood that survival wasn't just about making it through the cold months. It was about emerging from winter as strong, healthy, and unified communities ready to take on the challenges and opportunities of the coming year. The Viking approach to winter survival was also remarkably sustainable. Their methods could be repeated year after year, without depleting resources or degrading the environment. They worked with natural systems rather than against them, using the landscape and climate to their advantage rather than trying to overcome them through brute force. Their survival strategies were also remarkably egalitarian. While Viking society had hierarchies and inequalities, winter survival required everyone's contribution, and everyone's survival was important to the community's success. The knowledge and skills needed for winter survival were shared throughout the community, ensuring that everyone had the basic competencies needed to contribute to collective survival. Perhaps most remarkably, Vikings didn't just survive winter, they used it as a time for planning, preparation, and community building that made them stronger and more successful when warmer weather returned. Winter wasn't just something to be endured, it was an integral part of their annual cycle that contributed to their overall success as a culture. Their raids, explorations and expansions were all planned and prepared during winter months. The skills they developed for winter survival, cooperation, resource management, planning and resilience, were the same skills that made them successful warriors, traders and explorers. Winter survival training was also training for success in other aspects of Viking life. The communities that emerged from successful winters were stronger, more unified, and better prepared for the challenges of the coming year. The shared experience of surviving extreme conditions created bonds and trust that carried over into other activities. The planning and preparation skills developed for winter survival were applied to other community projects and goals. The technologies and techniques Vikings developed for winter survival were also applied to other aspects of their lives. Their knowledge of construction, preservation, heating and resource management made them better builders, farmers and craftsmen. Their understanding of nutrition, medicine, and physical fitness made them healthier and more capable in all their activities. The psychological skills they developed for winter survival, storytelling, conflict resolution, leadership and community building, made them more effective in their social and political relationships. The patience, persistence, and planning abilities required for winter survival were valuable in all aspects of their lives. In many ways, winter was the foundation of Viking civilization. It was during the long, cold months that they developed the skills, relationships, and cultural practices that made them one of the most successful and influential cultures in medieval Europe. Their ability to not just survive, but thrive in extreme conditions gave them confidence, resilience, and capabilities that served them well in all their endeavors. The legacy of Viking winter survival extends far beyond their own time and culture. Their techniques and approaches influenced survival practices throughout Northern Europe and continue to inform modern understanding of how humans can successfully adapt to extreme environments. Their integration of physical, psychological, and social strategies for survival provides a model that remains relevant for anyone facing challenging conditions. Their understanding that survival requires community cooperation, careful planning, and the integration of multiple strategies remains as valid today as it was 1,000 years ago. Their recognition that psychological well-being is as important as physical survival continues to inform modern approaches to emergency preparedness and community resilience, perhaps most importantly. Their example demonstrates that humans can not only survive, but thrive in even the most challenging conditions when they approach those challenges with intelligence, cooperation, and determination. The Vikings who gathered around their fires during the coldest nights of the year weren't just waiting for spring. They were building the foundations for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. When the last fire was banked and the final story told, when the wind finally stopped howling and the first bird sang its tentative song of spring, the Vikings who emerged from their longhouses weren't the same people who had entered them months before. They were stronger, more united, and better prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. They had faced the worst that nature could offer and emerged victorious, not through conquest, but through the more difficult triumph of intelligent adaptation and community cooperation. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable aspect of Viking winter survival. It wasn't just about making it through the cold. It was about using the challenge of extreme conditions to build something stronger, better, and more enduring than what had existed before. It was about turning survival into growth, endurance into strength, and community cooperation into the foundation for lasting success. In the end, the Vikings' approach to surviving the coldest nights of the year wasn't just about staying warm, fed, and sane through months of harsh conditions. It was about understanding that true survival requires more than just meeting immediate needs. It requires building the physical capabilities, social bonds, psychological resilience, and cultural practices that allow not just individuals but entire communities to thrive regardless of the challenges they face. That's how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year, not by simply enduring them, but by transforming them into the foundation for everything that made them remarkable. And in those long, cold nights around the fires in their longhouses, sharing food and stories and warmth, they weren't just surviving winter. They were creating the legacy that would echo through history long after the last snow had melted and the last saga had been told. But let's get specific about what a typical winter night actually looked like, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. And the details are what kept people alive when the temperature dropped so low that your exhaled breath could shatter like glass. The day would begin before dawn, which wasn't saying much considering dawn might not arrive until mid-morning, if it bothered to arrive at all. The fire keeper, whose job it was to maintain the central hearth through the night, would begin the process of building up the flames for the day ahead. This wasn't just throwing logs on a fire. This was a carefully orchestrated performance that required understanding wind patterns, wood types, and the delicate balance between generating heat and conserving fuel. The fire keeper would start by carefully removing the ash that had accumulated overnight, but not all of it. Some ash was left to create a bed for the new coals, providing insulation that would help the fire burn more efficiently. Then came the selection of wood, chosen not randomly but according to a specific strategy developed over centuries of trial and error. First, the kindling, dry birch bark and small twigs that would catch quickly and burn hot enough to ignite larger pieces. Then pencil, thin branches of pine or spruce, chosen because they contained natural resins that burned with intense heat. Next came finger, thick pieces of hardwood, oak or ash, that would burn steadily and provide sustained heat. Finally, the larger logs that would form the backbone of the day's fire, selected for their ability to burn long and hot while producing minimal smoke. But the fire keeper wasn't working alone. By the time the flames were crackling steadily, other members of the household were beginning to stir, and stirring in a Viking longhouse during winter was its own form of choreographed survival dance. The first people awake were usually the women responsible for food preparation, because getting a hot meal ready for 30 or 40 people required more time and effort than most modern people can imagine. They would approach the fire carefully, their breath visible in the cold air despite the warmth radiating from the flames. The longhouse might have been heated, but heated in Viking terms meant not immediately fatal rather than comfortable. These women understood that their work wasn't just about preparing food. It was about maintaining the caloric intake that everyone needed to generate internal heat and maintain the energy levels required for winter survival. The morning meal needed to provide enough fuel to get people through a day of indoor activities while maintaining body temperature in conditions that could still be dangerously cold despite the fire. The preparation began with checking the food stores, a daily ritual that served multiple purposes. First, it allowed for monitoring of remaining supplies, ensuring that rationing was adjusted as needed to make sure food lasted through the entire winter. Second, it provided an opportunity to check for spoilage or contamination that could threaten the health of the entire community. Third, it allowed for planning meals that would provide the right combination of calories, nutrients, and psychological satisfaction needed to maintain both physical and mental health. The breakfast preparation typically started with porridge, but this wasn't the thin gruel that might come to mind. Viking winter porridge was a thick, calorie-dense mixture of grains, preserved meat, fat, and whatever vegetables could be obtained from winter stores. The grains, usually barley or oats, were cooked slowly in large iron cauldrons, stirring constantly to prevent burning and to ensure even cooking. To this base were added chunks of preserved meat that had been soaked overnight to remove excess salt and make them more palatable. The meat wasn't just protein, it was flavor, fat, and psychological comfort rolled into one. A bowl of porridge with meat wasn't just breakfast. It was proof that the community's preservation efforts had been successful and that survival remained possible. Fat was added liberally, not for taste but for calories and warmth generation. A spoonful of bear fat or seal oil might not sound appetizing to modern palates, but to people whose bodies were burning thousands of calories just to maintain core temperature. It was liquid energy that could mean the difference between having a productive day and spending the day shivering by the fire. Preserved vegetables were added when available, not just for nutrition, but for psychological variety that helped combat the monotony that could lead to depression and loss of appetite. Dried onions, preserved turnips, or fermented cabbage added flavors and textures that made meals more satisfying and helped maintain the morale that was crucial for community survival. The cooking process itself generated heat and pleasant aromas that helped wake the rest of the household and created an atmosphere of comfort and security. The sounds of breakfast preparation, the bubbling of porridge, the crackling of fat, the clink of wooden spoons against iron cauldrons, were the sounds of successful survival, daily proof that the community's strategies were working. As the cooking progressed, other members of the household would begin their own morning routines, each carefully designed to maintain health and warmth while conserving energy and resources. Personal hygiene during winter was a balance between cleanliness and heat conservation, with each activity requiring careful consideration of its impact on body temperature. Washing was done quickly with heated water, usually just hands and face, with full-body washing reserved for special occasions or when absolutely necessary. The water itself was precious, requiring fuel to heat and effort to obtain, especially when sources might be frozen solid. Vikings understood that while cleanliness was important for health, hypothermia was more immediately dangerous than minor hygiene lapses. Clothing was checked and adjusted each morning, with special attention paid to any signs of wear or damage that could compromise warmth. A small tear in a tunic or a loose seam in a boot could become life-threatening if it allowed cold air to reach the skin. Repairs were made immediately, using needle and thread that were kept close to the fire to prevent them from becoming too stiff to use. The selection of daily clothing was a strategic decision based on planned activities and expected conditions. Multiple layers were standard, but the specific combination of under-tunics, over-tunics, cloaks, and accessories was chosen to provide maximum warmth while allowing for the movement required for daily tasks. Too many clothes, and you couldn't work effectively. Too few, and you risked hypothermia. Footwear received special attention because feet were particularly vulnerable to cold injury. Boots were checked for moisture, which could freeze and cause frostbite. Socks were changed if they had become damp from sweat or snow. Extra insulation was added if the day's activities would require extended time away from the fire, or if particularly cold conditions were expected. As people completed their morning preparations, they would gather around the central fire for the communal breakfast that was both meal and social ceremony. The seating arrangement wasn't random. It reflected both social hierarchy and practical considerations about heat distribution and access to food. The most important people sat closest to the fire, but they also had responsibilities that went with their privileged positions. The jarl or household head was expected to lead discussions about the day's activities, settle any disputes that had arisen overnight, and make decisions about resource allocation and community priorities. Conversations during breakfast served multiple purposes beyond simple social interaction. News was shared about the weather conditions outside, the status of food and fuel supplies, the health of community members, and any plans for the day's activities. This information sharing was crucial for coordinating community efforts and ensuring that everyone understood their roles in the day's survival strategies. The meal itself was eaten slowly, not just for enjoyment, but for practical reasons related to heat generation and resource conservation. Eating slowly helped the body generate more heat through the digestive process, while also ensuring that people felt satisfied with smaller portions, helping stretch limited food supplies. Hot drinks accompanied the meal, usually heated ale or mead, but sometimes herbal teas made from preserved plants that provided both warmth and medicinal benefits. These hot beverages served multiple functions. They provided additional calories, helped raise body temperature, offered medicinal compounds that supported health during stressful conditions, and contributed to the social atmosphere that was crucial for psychological survival. After breakfast, the day's activities would begin in earnest, with each person taking on tasks that contributed to the community's survival while maintaining their own health and warmth. But these weren't just random activities. They were carefully planned and coordinated efforts that addressed the multiple challenges of winter survival. Indoor maintenance was a constant requirement that provided both necessary work and physical activity that helped generate body heat. The longhouse required daily attention to maintain its effectiveness as a survival shelter. The fire needed constant tending, with fuel added regularly and ash removed to maintain efficient burning. The smoke hole in the roof needed adjustment based on wind conditions and weather changes. Wall gaps needed checking and repair to prevent heat loss. Food preparation was an ongoing process that occupied much of the day for many community members. Preserved foods needed preparation before eating, soaking to remove excess salt, grinding to make them easier to digest, mixing with other ingredients to improve nutrition and palatability. Fresh food preparation included processing any game that might have been obtained, preparing vegetables from storage, and managing the fermentation processes that provided both preserved foods and alcoholic beverages. Craft work provided both necessary items and psychological benefits that were crucial for winter survival. People worked on clothing repair and creation, tool maintenance and production, and household items that would be needed for survival or comfort. This work wasn't just practical, it was also mentally stimulating and socially interactive, providing the psychological engagement that helped prevent depression and maintain community bonds. The women often gathered together for spinning, weaving, and sewing, creating an informal social network that served multiple survival functions. They shared knowledge about techniques and resources, discussed community concerns and problems, and provided mutual support during the stressful period of winter survival. Their conversations covered everything from practical matters like food rationing to social issues like conflict resolution to planning for future activities. Men engaged in their own group activities that combined practical work with social interaction. Tool maintenance and repair, weapon care, and construction projects provided opportunities for collaboration and skill sharing. These activities also allowed for discussions about community defense, resource management, and planning for spring and summer activities. The work itself was carefully paced to provide steady activity without exhausting people whose caloric intake might be limited. Strenuous work was avoided unless absolutely necessary, because the energy cost might exceed the benefits, leaving people weakened and more vulnerable to cold and illness. Children had their own activities that were designed to maintain their health and development while contributing to community survival. They helped with simple tasks like sorting materials, feeding animals, and assisting with food preparation. But they also had time for play and learning that was crucial for their psychological development and future survival skills. Children's games often incorporated elements of survival training, teaching skills like tool use, resource identification, and social cooperation in forms that were engaging and age-appropriate. These games weren't just entertainment. They were education that prepared children to contribute to community survival and eventually take on adult responsibilities. Education during winter wasn't formal schooling, as we might understand it, but it was comprehensive and practical. Children learned survival skills by observing and gradually participating in adult activities. They learned social skills through interaction with community members of all ages. They learned cultural knowledge through stories, songs, and traditions that were shared during long winter evenings. As the day progressed, the activities and rhythms of the longhouse created a complex social environment that balanced individual needs with community requirements. People moved between individual work and group activities, between practical tasks and social interaction, between physical activity and rest, all within the carefully maintained environment of the heated longhouse. The management of resources throughout the day required constant attention and careful decision-making. Fuel consumption had to be balanced against heat needs, with decisions made about when to add wood to the fire and when to bank the coals to conserve fuel. Food consumption had to be monitored to ensure adequate nutrition while making supplies last through the entire winter period. Water management was another daily challenge that required planning and effort. In winter, water sources might be frozen, requiring effort to break ice and haul water to the longhouse. The water then had to be heated for cooking and cleaning, requiring additional fuel and time. Some communities maintained heated water containers near the fire to ensure a constant supply of warm water for daily needs. Waste management during winter was a practical challenge that required careful handling to maintain sanitation while conserving heat. Human waste was typically handled through designated areas that were kept as far as possible from living and food preparation areas while still being accessible in harsh weather conditions. The scheduling of activities throughout the day was designed to maximize efficiency while maintaining the social interaction that was crucial for psychological survival. Work periods were interspersed with breaks for food, conversation, and rest. Group activities were balanced with individual work time. Physical activity was balanced with sedentary tasks. As evening approached, the pace of activities would gradually shift toward the more social and recreational activities that were crucial for maintaining morale and community bonds. The evening meal was typically the largest and most social meal of the day, providing both physical sustenance and psychological satisfaction that helped prepare people for the long night ahead. Evening meal preparation was often a community effort that involved multiple people working together to create a meal that was both nutritious and satisfying. The preparation itself was a social activity that provided opportunities for conversation, collaboration, and mutual support. The cooking process generated heat and pleasant aromas that created an atmosphere of comfort and security within the longhouse. The evening meal typically consisted of stew or porridge that had been simmering throughout the day, with additional ingredients added as the meal was prepared. Fresh bread, when possible, was baked in the coals of the fire, providing both food and the psychologically satisfying aroma of baking bread. Preserved meats and vegetables were added to create meals that were both filling and flavorful. The social aspect of the evening meal was as important as the nutritional aspect. This was the time when the community came together to share not just food but also news, stories, plans, and concerns. The meal was eaten slowly, with conversation flowing freely as people relaxed from the day's work and prepared for the evening's social activities. After the evening meal, the longhouse would transition into its evening social mode, with activities designed to maintain psychological well-being and community bonds during the long hours before sleep. This was when storytelling, music, games, and other social activities took center stage in the community's survival strategy. The storytelling tradition that was so crucial to Viking winter survival wasn't just random entertainment. It was a carefully developed cultural practice that served multiple psychological and social functions. Stories were chosen and told to provide specific benefits, entertainment that helped pass the long hours, education that transmitted important cultural knowledge, inspiration that helped maintain hope and determination, and social bonding that reinforced community unity. The storytellers themselves were skilled practitioners who understood their role in community survival. They knew how to pace their stories to maintain interest throughout long evenings, how to adapt their tales to the mood and needs of their audience, and how to use their stories to address community concerns and reinforce important values. Epic stories about heroic adventures provided psychological escape from the confines of winter survival, allowing people to imagine themselves in different circumstances and maintain hope for better times. Historical stories about successful survival and triumph over adversity provided inspiration and practical knowledge about overcoming challenges. Mythological stories provided explanations for current hardships and promised eventual reward for endurance and proper behavior. The stories were interactive, with audiences encouraged to participate through responses, questions, and contributions to the narrative. This participation helped maintain engagement and prevented the passive listening that could lead to drowsiness or disinterest. The interactive nature of storytelling also reinforced social bonds and provided outlets for creativity and self-expression. Music complemented storytelling as another crucial component of evening entertainment and psychological maintenance. Singing together was both enjoyable and physically beneficial, providing gentle exercise that helped generate body heat while creating a sense of unity and shared purpose. The songs chosen for winter evenings served specific functions work songs that helped maintain rhythm during repetitive tasks, ceremonial songs that reinforced cultural identity and values, entertaining songs that provided humor and light-heartedness, and sacred songs that provided spiritual comfort and connection to larger meanings. Instrumental music provided variety and sophistication to evening entertainment. Musicians were skilled craftspeople who maintained and played instruments that required considerable expertise. The music they provided wasn't just background entertainment. It was skilled performance that commanded attention and provided psychological benefits through beauty, complexity, and emotional expression. Games and competitions provided mental stimulation and social interaction that helped maintain cognitive function and community bonds. Board games like Nefertofel required strategic thinking and provided intellectual challenge during periods when mental stimulation might otherwise be limited. Physical games and competitions provided exercise and entertainment while reinforcing social hierarchies and relationships. The games weren't just recreational. They often involved elements that reinforced survival skills and cultural values. Strategic games developed planning and decision-making abilities. Physical games maintained fitness and coordination. Social games reinforced cooperation and communication skills. Competitive games provided outlets for aggression and ambition that might otherwise create community conflicts. As the evening progressed and people prepared for sleep, the longhouse would undergo another transition, shifting from social space to sleeping arrangement that maximized warmth and safety during the long, cold night ahead. This transition was as carefully orchestrated as any other aspect of Viking winter survival. The fire would be banked for the night, with coals arranged and covered to provide steady heat throughout the night while conserving fuel for the following day. This banking process required considerable skill and experience, because the fire needed to provide enough heat to prevent freezing while not consuming so much fuel that supplies would be exhausted before spring. Sleeping arrangements would be checked and adjusted, with furs and blankets arranged for maximum warmth and comfort. Heated stones would be prepared and wrapped in cloth to provide additional warmth for feet and hands during the coldest parts of the night. Additional clothing would be laid out for quick access if emergency warming was needed during the night. The assignment of night watches was another crucial aspect of nighttime survival planning. Someone needed to be responsible for maintaining the fire throughout the night, monitoring for any problems or emergencies, and ensuring that the community remained safe and warm until morning. This responsibility was shared among community members, with shifts assigned based on individual capabilities and community needs. The night watch wasn't just about fire maintenance. It was about community security and safety during the most vulnerable hours. The person on watch was responsible for monitoring weather conditions, listening for any signs of problems or dangers, and being prepared to wake others if emergency action was required. As people settled into their sleeping areas, the longhouse would gradually quiet, but it wouldn't become completely silent. The sounds of winter survival continued throughout the night, the crackling of the banked fire, the breathing of sleeping people, the occasional adjustment of blankets or movement of someone seeking a more comfortable position, the footsteps of the night watch making their rounds. These sounds weren't disturbances, they were reassurances that the community survival system was functioning properly. The silence of a completely quiet longhouse would actually have been alarming, suggesting that something had gone wrong with the heating system or community safety arrangements. The night itself was when the most critical aspects of Viking winter survival were tested. Body heat generation and retention, the effectiveness of insulation systems, the adequacy of food and fuel supplies, and the strength of community bonds were all put to their greatest test during the long, cold hours when outside temperatures reached their most dangerous levels. But the Vikings who had developed these survival systems understood that surviving the night wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about maintaining the complete system of physical, psychological, and social supports that made survival possible. Their approach to winter nights wasn't just about staying warm until morning. It was about emerging from each night stronger, more unified, and better prepared for the challenges ahead. And when morning finally came, when the night watch began building up the fire for another day, and the longhouse began stirring with the sounds of another day's survival activities, the Vikings who emerged from their furs weren't just relieved survivors of another night's ordeal. They were members of a community that had successfully met another challenge through intelligence, cooperation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced and overcome similar trials. This daily cycle of survival, repeated throughout the long winter months, created more than just the means to endure harsh conditions. It created the foundation of a culture that would go on to reshape the medieval world through exploration, trade, conquest, and colonization. The skills, relationships, and cultural practices developed during those long winter nights in smoky longhouses became the basis for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. That's the true story of how Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year, not through simple endurance or brute toughness, but through the development of comprehensive survival systems that addressed every aspect of human need during extreme conditions. They didn't just survive winter, they used winter as the foundation for building something far greater than survival itself.